The Phantom Killer. The Texarkana Moonlight Murders. In the early months of 1946, Texarkana was a serene border city straddling Texas and Arkansas, where residents lived without the shadow of locks or fear. This tranquility vanished over a 10-week span, when a hooded predator emerged from the shadows, transforming the region into a theater of national dread. Known as the Phantom Killer, he remains one of history's most elusive enigmas, never apprehended or identified. The reign of terror commenced on February 22, 1946, when Jimmy Hollis and Mary Jean Larry were confronted in a secluded lover's lane. A man donning a white cloth mask with jagged eye slits shined a blinding light into their car, demanding the vehicle before launching a brutal assault. Though severely injured, both survived, providing the only eyewitness descriptions of the attacker. Initially dismissed as an isolated incident, the violence escalated on March 24, 1946, with the discovery of Richard Griffin and Polly Ann Moore. Both were found shot to death near Highway 67 West in a calculated execution that left no forensic trail. The community's psychological walls crumbled. Firearms and deadbolts sold out instantly as the city enacted unofficial martial law. On April 14, 1946, the Phantom struck again, targeting 16-year-old Paul Martin and 15-year-old Betty Jo Booker after a VFW dance. Their bodies were found in separate locations, shot with precision. Despite the intervention of legendary Texas Ranger Manuel T. Lone Wolf Gonzalez, the killer adapted. On May 3, he abandoned the roads to attack Virgil and Katie Starks in their own farmhouse. Virgil survived, but Katie was murdered, proving no one was safe, even behind closed doors. Though suspects like Ewell Swinney emerged, no one was ever convicted, leaving the Moonlight Murders an open wound in American history. Hook? Could a serial killer be hiding in your own neighborhood for decades without anyone knowing? CTA. If you want to see more deep dives into these chilling cold cases, make sure to hit that like button and subscribe for our weekly investigations. The I-70 Killer. The Highway Predator. During the spring of 1992, a methodical executioner utilized Interstate 70 as a hunting corridor across the Midwest. He didn't seek notoriety through letters or calls. Instead, he walked into retail stores in broad daylight, ending lives in mere minutes before melting back into the traffic. The spree began on April 8 in Indianapolis, where 26-year-old Robin Fuldauer was murdered while working alone at a Payless shoe source. The scene was eerily sterile, with robbery appearing as a secondary afterthought to the clinical violence. 3 days later, the killer struck a bridal shop in Wichita, Kansas, claiming the lives of Patricia Smith and Patricia Magers. The use of a .22 caliber firearm and the daytime retail setting established a terrifyingly consistent profile. On April 27th, the violence moved to Terre Haute, Indiana, where Michael McCown was killed at a ceramics shop. Investigators believe McCown, who wore his hair long, may have been mistaken for a woman, fitting the killer's preference for lone female clerks. By May, the killer reached Missouri. Nancy Kitzmiller was murdered in St. Charles on May 3, followed by Sarah Blessing in Raytown on May 7. Witnesses described an unassuming man with reddish hair and a lazy eyelid, someone who could easily blend into any crowd. Forensic analysis pointed toward a rare Irma Werke ET-22 semi-automatic pistol, suggesting the killer had specific firearm access. Despite a surviving victim in a similar Texas spree a year later, the I-70 killer was never officially linked to subsequent crimes or caught, leaving a trail of 6 victims and an empty chair in the interrogation room. Hook. Imagine walking into a store at noon and never coming out. That was the reality for the I-70 victims. CTA. Do you think this killer is still out there? Let us know your theories in the comments below. We read every single one. The Doodler. San Francisco's sketchbook slasher. In the mid-1970s, San Francisco was a beacon of liberation. Yet beneath the neon lights of the gay nightlife scene, a predator known as the Doodler was hunting. He didn't use brute force to isolate his targets. He used talent. He would approach men in bars and restaurants, strike up a conversation, and begin sketching their portraits to build trust. Once the victim was lured into a private setting, the artist would reveal a knife. The first recognized victim, Gerald Earl Kavanaugh, was found in January 1974 at Ocean Beach. Over the next year, at least 5 more men, including Joseph Stevens and Klaus Christman, were found stabbed to death. However, the true body count is estimated to be as high as 14. The most frustrating aspect of the Doodler case is that the police actually had a primary suspect. They even had survivors who had seen the killer's face and survived his blade. However, during an era of intense social stigma, these survivors refused to testify in open court, fearing that outing themselves would destroy their professional and personal lives. The killer essentially used the era's homophobia as a shield, knowing his victims were more afraid of the public eye than they were of him. In recent years, the SFPD has released age-progressed sketches and offered a $100,000 reward, hoping that modern Dina or a deathbed confession will finally put a name to the man who sketched his victims before he slaughtered them. Hook, a killer who draws his victims before he kills them, sounds like a movie plot. But for San Francisco, it was a living nightmare. CTA. We're uncovering the darkest corners of history. Don't miss our next episode. Ring that notification bell so you're always in the loop. Bible John, the ballroom butcher. Late 1960s Glasgow was defined by the rhythm of the Barrowland Ballroom, a place for music and dance that unknowingly hosted a monster. This predator, dubbed Bible John, hunted within the crowd, selecting women under the bright lights of the dance floor. His first victim, Patricia Docker, was found in February 1968. A year later, Jemima McDonald was discovered in a derelict tenement. The case reached a fever pitch in October 1969 with the murder of Helen Puttock. Unlike the previous victims, Helen had spent the evening with her sister, who provided a detailed account of the man Helen left with. He was well-dressed, polite, and quoted extensive passages from the Bible, often condemning the adulterous nature of the ballroom. This religious fixation became the hallmark of the investigation. The suspect reportedly harbored a deep-seated misogyny, specifically targeting women who were menstruating, a detail reflected in his crude comments about temples of sin. The investigation was a milestone in Scottish history, marking the first time a composite sketch was authorized for public release. The image of the clean-cut man with red hair haunted Glasgow for generations. While theories have attempted to link the crimes to convicted murderer Peter Tobin, evidence remains inconclusive. Bible John vanished as suddenly as he appeared, leaving behind a legacy of fear that fundamentally changed Scottish nightlife, proving that sometimes the most dangerous person in the room is the one who looks the most righteous. Hook, he quoted scripture while planning his next strike. Was Bible John a religious fanatic, or just a master of disguise? CTA. If you're enjoying this deep dive, share this video with a friend who loves true crime history. It helps the channel grow. The West Mesa Bone Collector. The West Mesa of Albuquerque, New Mexico, is a vast, wind-swept desert that served as a secret graveyard for years. Between 2001 and 2005, numerous women vanished from the city's fringes. Many were struggling with addiction or sex work, leading to a delayed response from authorities. The horrific reality surfaced on February 2, 2009, when a dog walker discovered a human bone protruding from the dirt. Subsequent excavations revealed a mass burial site containing the remains of 11 women and an unborn fetus. This wasn't a dumping ground for a single night of rage. It was a curated cemetery where a serial predator had returned time and again to bury his victims in shallow, deliberate graves. The victims, predominantly Hispanic women aged 15 to 32, were mostly linked to the city's war zone district. The investigation became the largest in the history of the Albuquerque Police Department. While no one has ever been charged, two names dominate the discussion. Lorenzo Montoya, who lived near the site and was killed by a teenager he was attempting to assault in 2006, and Joseph Blee, a convicted serial rapist. The timeline of the disappearances suggests the killer stopped around 2005, leading many to believe the perpetrator either died or was incarcerated for unrelated crimes. To this day, the West Mesa remains a somber memorial to those lost in the desert, as the bone collector's identity remains buried in the sand. Hook, 11 bodies, 1 desert, and 0 arrests. How did a killer operate a private cemetery for 4 years without getting caught? CTA. We cover unsolved mysteries every week. Subscribe now to join our community of armchair detectives and help us keep these stories alive. The Freeway Phantom, DC's forgotten shadow. In the early 1970s, Washington, D.C. was gripped by the Freeway Phantom, a predator who abducted 6 young African-American girls between 1971 and 1972. The victims, Carol Spinks, Darlenia Johnson, Brenda Crockett, Nenemosha Yates, Brenda Woodard, and Diane Williams, ranged in age from 10 to 18. The killer's signature was dumping the bodies along the capital's busy freeways, often in broad daylight. The terror became psychological on November 15, 1971, when the body of Brenda Woodard was found with a chilling note tucked into her pocket. The note, likely dictated by the killer and written by Brenda herself, mocked the police and used the sophisticated word tantamount, suggesting a killer who was educated and arrogant. The investigation was plagued by the racial tensions of the era and jurisdictional hurdles between D.C. and Maryland police. One consistent and haunting detail was that several victims were found without their shoes, suggesting a ritualistic trophy-taking. Despite interviewing numerous suspects, including members of a local gang known as the Green Vega, no one was ever brought to justice. The Freeway Phantom stopped his activity after the murder of Diane Williams in September 1972, leaving behind a city of parents too terrified to let their children walk to the store. Decades later, the note remains the most significant piece of evidence. A literal voice from a killer who proved that the nation's capital was not immune to the darkness. Hook, he forced his victim to write her own death note. The Freeway Phantom wasn't just a killer. He was a psychological tormentor. CTA. Which of these cases do you think is the most likely to be solved with modern DNA? Drop a comment below. The Cleveland Torso Murderer, the Mad Butcher. During the height of the Great Depression, Cleveland was home to a series of crimes so gruesome they challenged the resolve of America's most famous lawman, Eliot Ness. Between 1935 and 1938, a killer dubbed the Mad Butcher of Kingsbury Run terrorized the city's shantytowns. The perpetrator didn't just kill, he surgically dismembered his victims, often while they were still alive. The official count stands at 12, though some believe the true number exceeds 20. The victims were frequently drifters or Kingsbury Run residents whose identities were lost to poverty, making them nearly impossible to identify after their heads were removed. The case became a personal vendetta for Eliot Ness, who was Cleveland's public safety director at the time. In a desperate attempt to flush out the killer, Ness ordered the burning of the Kingsbury Run shantytowns, a controversial move that displaced hundreds of homeless people, but failed to stop the butcher. The killer even taunted Ness by placing the remains of 2 victims within sight of his office window. While suspects like Frank Dolezal and Dr. Francis Sweeney were investigated, Sweeney even failed early polygraph tests administered by Ness. No one was ever convicted. The Cleveland Torso murders remain a dark masterpiece of forensic failure, representing the one battle the untouchable Elliot Ness could never win. Hook. Not even the man who caught Al Capone could stop the Mad Butcher of Cleveland. CTA, if you love historical true crime, check out our playlist on 1930s mysteries. There's so much more to uncover. The Zodiac Killer, the master of spectacle. While many killers avoid the light, the Zodiac Killer thrived in it. Operating in Northern California in the late 1960s, he turned murder into a media circus. His confirmed victims include David Faraday, Betty Lou Jensen, Darlene Ferrin, Cecilia Shepard, and Paul Stein, though he claimed to have killed 37 people. The Zodiac's brand was defined by his cryptic ciphers, taunting letters to the San Francisco Chronicle, and a hooded costume featuring a crosshair symbol. He was a master of terror, threatening to wipe out a school bus and calling police departments to report his own crimes, often speaking in a low, monotonous drone. The investigation was a quagmire of jurisdictional friction and forensic limitations. Despite a wealth of evidence, including fingerprints, a partial DNA profile from a stamp, and several survivors like Michael Mageau and Brian Hartnell, the Zodiac was never caught. The primary suspect, Arthur Lee Allen, was a convicted sex offender who possessed the same Type W boots worn at one of the scenes. But DNA and handwriting samples failed to provide a definitive match. The case remains a cultural phenomenon, fueled by the Z340 cipher, which took 51 years to solve. The Zodiac proved that a killer who controls the narrative can become immortal, remaining a ghost in the machinery of American justice. Hook. He left behind ciphers, footprints, and even his own DNA. Yet the Zodiac remains the most famous ghost in criminal history.